Welcome to this presentation on leading a successful local work group, sponsored by the National Conservation Planning Partnership. Three topics we'll cover during the course of this presentation will be making local work groups meaningful, who to involve, and partnering for local work group activities, and the top 10 tips for leading a successful local work group. The objective for our presentation is to provide tips, techniques, and recommendations for leading successful local work group activities, including local work group membership and operating procedures, utilizing natural resource data to identify natural resource conservation issues to be addressed in the local work group area, the identification of high priority projects and practices to promote, and the identification of private, local, state, federal partners and programs for the development of proposals and projects. Let's start with our first topic, making local work groups meaningful. In making local work groups meaningful, we'll talk about three particular elements during the course of this presentation: hosting the local work group, the influence the local work group can have, and conducting in-person, virtual, and blended in-person virtual events. Let's speak to the beginning of local work groups. Language for local work groups was provided in the 1985 Farm Bill. A great deal of leadership came from the National Association of Conservation Districts in promoting locally led conservation and the need for local work groups to provide information to their USDA NRCS partners regarding conservation programs. The first program that the local work groups were mentioned in was the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP. Also, in the 1985 Farm Bill, it said that only government members could be involved in a local work group based on the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Good news occurred with 2008 Farm Bill changes. In the 2008 Farm Bill, local work groups became subcommittees of the State Technical Committee. The State Technical Committee is exempted from the Federal Advisory Committee Act, allowing for members in our local work groups to go beyond just government. Commodity organizations, landowners, fish and wildlife advocacy groups, various corporations and organizations could be involved in our local work groups after 2008. Some very good news for local work groups. Much more information is provided in the Federal Register on local work groups if you have interest in pursuing more information. Let's speak to the hosting of local work group activities in the context of making local work groups meaningful. In the original 1985 Farm Bill, conservation districts were written in to host and to chair local work group activities. This was brought about through a lot of work of the National Association of Conservation Districts and is included in language not only in the 1985 Farm Bill, but in following farm bills and the Natural Resources Conservation Service General Manual. If a conservation district chooses not to chair or cannot chair, the Natural Resource Conservation Service staff can host and chair a local work group meetings and activities. Others can host and or chair local work group activities also based on that particular local work group's operating procedures. A meaningful local work group will have influence in regards to decision-making on natural resource conservation programs. Let's speak a bit about the USDA and its structure regarding Natural Resource Conservation Service conservation programs. The state conservationist is the ultimate decision maker for USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service programs in his or her state. They have formed a state technical committee. This becomes an advisory group to the state conservationist and includes multiple agencies and multiple organizations that are involved. These groups are in the dozens normally and provide the opportunity for the state conservationists to talk about and work with them regarding coordination of various programs and activities of USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're also Federal Advisory Committee Act exempt, which means that this state technical committee can have not only agency personnel and government personnel, but non-government personnel also. Again, they provide some advice and counsel to the state conservationist, who is the ultimate decision maker for USDA NRCS programs within their state. Our local work group is a subgroup of the state technical committee, and also, and many times, a member of the state technical committee. Best work that we can do as a local work group will be to provide local priorities and input to conservation needs and programs and projects within our local work group area. We provide that to the state technical committee and to the state conservationists. I find that meaningful local work groups have some elements that are pretty common across the nation. One is that they take the time to develop their own operating procedures and make note of when they're going to meet, how they meet, who's going to be chairing, who's going to be staffing the local work group, subcommittees and things like that are all noted in their operating procedures. Meaningful local work groups also concentrate on the resource conservation priorities. They identify those, they talk about them, the multi-agency nature and multi-organization nature and landowners in discussions together about the resource conservation priorities. Meaningful local work groups also talk about and work from practice prevalence and eligibility. What is the most important practices that we need to be promoting in our local work group area to address conservation issues in our local work group area? Some local work groups also work on ranking questions, not only for the USDA NRCS programs, but also for other agencies and organizations, programs, and projects. And they give advice on how those questions should be formed in order to match the resource conservation priorities and what practices they want to promote in their area. In some programs, they allow hold downs. Hold downs are the amount of money, the maximum amount of money for a particular practice. And this was done in the past quite a bit because one practice could actually take all of the fundings that was available in a particular program. So the local work group would identify hold downs, an amount that would be the top amount for that practice. Funding pools, an interesting concept and used by many local work groups, is to identify a land use or land uses that they want to have applications submitted for. And then the applications that are submitted would only be considered against other applications for that particular land use or that particular funding pool. Funding pools based on land use could be things like rangeland, forestry, cropland, irrigated cropland, that sort of thing. Or funding pools for resource issues could be for water quality, noxious weed control, and other particular conservation issues. Meaningful local work groups have taken a look at resource data and maps available from various sources. The local, state, and federal sources, and also private sources of resource data and maps as they consider what resource conservation needs are for their local area. The State Technical Committee, as I mentioned before, is where this subcommittee, the local work group, is a subcommittee of the State Technical Committee and provides advice to the State Technical Committee. And in many cases, a local work group has a representative on the State Technical Committee. Local work group operating procedures. The local work group operating procedures are unique to each local work group, meaning that that particular local work group can determine certain things about their membership, about their times of day that they would meet, or the frequency that they would meet, how they would make decisions, and that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about that operating procedures. Certainly, local work groups that are meaningful have a membership that is diverse. of government entities from the local, state, and federal sources, and also non-government and industry and landowners. And local work groups that have really paid attention to their membership have identified those groups and have reached out to them for an invitation to join the local work group activities. The operating procedure should include who is convening and chairing the local work group. And as I mentioned before, the Conservation District role is very important in this if they'll accept that role. The NRCS staff responsibilities include data and reporting, and certainly the participation and the results of previous year's activities in USDA programs in particular. And staff responsibilities for NRCS can also include reaching out to other organizations and agencies for their data, their reporting, and their participation in programs. Promotion and marketing is a big part of what a local work group operating procedure should include. How do we promote the activities of the local work group when we convene, getting information out to individuals, at least letting people know about the programs and the projects that are available through the work of the local work group. Decision making is an important part to include in your operating procedures. While many local work groups use consensus as their way of decision making, some other local work groups will formalize that consensus discussion with a vote to indicate the approval of certain highly important pieces of decision that were made by the local work group. The importance of working committees. Effective local work groups also will include working committees, and this often means that they'll be working on projects or proposals, program proposals, and that sort of thing on behalf of the local work group. So the formation of working committee on this or that or the other resource issue or this or that or the other program proposal is commonplace in effective local work groups. Effective local work groups also post their recommendations to the State Technical Committee, specifically for USDA programs related to that local area. You find examples of local work groups that have become meaningful in several different places. One is the development of basin plans and the work of a local work group around the basin plan that's important to their local work group area. This again also include, the opportunity to talk about watersheds and watershed plans and water use and resource use and catastrophes and that sort of thing. Very important part of what a local work group could do. The formation of the resource data and resource assessment when making decisions and recommending decisions about priorities and projects and programs and activities, a very, very important part of making a local work group meaningful. So collection of that resource data and resource assessment information from a wide variety of sources, local, state, and federal sources, as well as corporate and nonprofit organization resource data. You find that most local work groups that are meaningful also have really taken the time to reach out to various stakeholders, not only the ones that we've worked with in the past, but also the ones that we need to work with into the future. This would represent landowners, landowner organizations, commodity organizations, fish and wildlife organizations, land trusts, and just a host of different other organizations. And then agencies at that local, state, and federal level, all in the same place talking about the resource needs through stakeholder involvement. And then those organizations, the local work groups that have really spent time looking for underserved audiences also in their stakeholder involvement. This sets up a natural opportunity for regional conservation partnership program and watershed program proposals. When you have that many people, that many different organizations, that many partners in a room talking about conservation priorities, it's logical that you would propose that a RCPP program proposal could come from that, especially if we were talking about the shared resources and shared programs and shared activities. And in the larger scale, an entire watershed program proposal under the Public Law 566 watershed program or emergency watershed program when there have been natural catastrophes that have occurred in the local area. Really effective, meaningful local work groups share resources between organizations, between landowners, between agencies. You find that time is being shared, funding is being shared within those organizations. Sometimes people are being shared within the organizations. Certainly data and assessments are being shared among the local work group members. Let's envision what a meaningful local work group would look like and what they would be doing. First, local work groups that are meaningful have moved beyond just one annual meeting to talk about the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and the priorities for only one USDA natural resource conservation program. They've advanced way beyond that and are talking about programs of different organizations and different agencies in their local work group area. So again, I want to emphasize that most of the most meaningful local work groups have went beyond just an annual exercise for the EQIP program. You'll also find that the vision for a meaningful local work group would include that resource data that's utilized. So not only collecting that data for the local work group area, but also how it's utilized in the priorities for the resource conditions and needs that need to be met. That would include the resource assessment at both a local and a watershed level and how we're using that resource data to come up with assessment of what is needed for conservation practices, projects, and programs. When you envision a meaningful local work group, we also speak about the local input on priority natural resource needs at that local level, at the state level, and at the federal level for programs. And not just the Natural Resource Conservation Service-led programs, but also private programs and government programs alike. When you find a meaningful local work group, you also find a great deal of multi-agency organization participation and the use of the local work group to bounce ideas off of, to talk about critical needs and issues and things that need to be met within that local work group area. Local work groups that are meaningful also have influence on the programs in their local work group area that are available to land managers. The opportunity to be able to meet and talk, local, state, federal agencies, private organizations and corporations and landowners to talk about the programs that are needed and to make sure that the organizations and agencies know about what those needs are. Same with projects. The development of projects specific to conservation needs within the local area is an important part of the influence a meaningful local work group can have. Also, meaningful local work groups talk about policies that sometimes are getting in the way of good implementation or are needed to enhance the implementation of conservation projects and programs and practices within their local work group area. And in particular, looking at underserved audiences and underserved land managers in their particular local work group area. And let me emphasize again, this is the influence not only just for government, but also non-government entities. When envisioning a meaningful local work group, you find that coordination is a big part of what they will be doing. Most of that coordination is based on the best services and programs for the landowners and operators within their local work group area. They've actually went out and found out what it is, the practices that are needed, the programs that are needed, and bring that to the local work group discussion. You'll find that that coordination of a meaningful local work group also includes the agencies and organizations that are working together. A diverse set of local, state, and federal agencies and organizations of different types and different interests working together for the good of conservation. You'll also find that they have shared resources, the time, the money, the people, data, and other resources they're sharing willingly to advance the conservation work within a local work group area. The coordination also means that people know who to contact. Not only do the landowners and operators know who to contact, for different programs and activities, but also the local work group members know who to contact. And if they have someone looking for a particular program that they don't run, they can also make sure that they've got that information handy so that they can get that to the local landowner or operator. Local work groups also coordinate on where to get technical assistance and how to get that technical assistance and how to request that technical assistance for conservation work. The coordination of where and how to sign up for programs, and when you talk about a local work group that's advancing more than just one USDA program, then more than just EQIP, you'll talk about different programs that local work group would have interest in, and the members would know how to recommend where to sign up for the particular programs that are available. So with that vision of what a meaningful local work group would look like and be doing, let's speak about the in-person, virtual, and blended events of a local work group. First, we'll speak about the importance of session designs for your particular event for your local work group. We'll talk about the importance of facilitation, and we'll talk about the importance of planning for and making good decisions about logistics for your event. Best local work group events start with a good session design for the event. And that starts with a good pre-meeting between the local work group sponsor and the chair of that local work group. Primarily, if it's the conservation district, it would be the conservation district chair, the district manager, and probably the NRCS district conservationist. And a discussion of what that group actually wants to accomplish at that local work group event, be it a meeting, a stakeholder meeting, an activity for the community, whatever that might be. And then, with that information about what the sponsors want to accomplish, the designing of the exercises to involve the participants in a meaningful way, meaning that the participants each have a chance to talk about those conservation priorities, talk about the needs, talk about practices that are needed, talk about projects and programs that are needed in that local work group area. And you design the exercises to match getting that done within your event. Now, we have a wide variety of ways that we can do sessions nowadays. And one is the in-person that we used to do from the 1985 on. We primarily concentrated on in-person type events. But now we know we can do the virtual events, the Zoom meetings, or the other meetings that would allow us to be able to meet and not be in person. And what's probably going to be in our future is what we're doing more so now is that there are people meeting in person and then also people tuning in via the virtual event. And the blended sessions certainly require the extra thought for participant involvement. The in-persons, we've had a lot of training and facilitation and work and planning those. The virtual, we've had 2 years worth of experience in doing that. And now the blended sessions will require even more thought in our session designs. In the development of a session design, you talk about the exercises that will get to the objective of the event, but you also talk about the timing of those exercises. How much time would it take to have each individual speak about a priority that they have, and then combine that with a small group activity at a table, and then finally bring that to the larger group for their consideration. Also important in this is the presenters and the presentations that are made during the course of the event. Remember that a good event means that participation usually occurs from the participants within the first few minutes and within the first 30 minutes. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is make sure the session design includes interactive activities early on in the event, sprinkled in with some of the presentation on data and information and whatnot. What I've seen unsuccessful session designs have is that we've just made a lot of information available in presentation and not allowed the participants to do any type of reaction or discussion or that sort of thing. So stay away from that. Make sure we put in our session design good interactive activities. I'm offering that at that email address at the bottom of the page there, I've got hundreds of example session designs available for successful local work group events, and happy to share those with you. So you need only go to Ray Ledgerwood at msn.com and say, hey Ray, what do you have for this session design or that session design? Be happy to provide that for you. So at this point, you've got a great session design, you've got a great event that you have talked about, and now you're ready to promote and market that event. And by all means, the first part of that promotion is letting key individuals know by personal contact that we have an event coming up for local work groups, the importance of that event, what will be accomplished during that event, and then initiating the invitations either by email or other mechanism to get the information out. We find that the best invitations and promotion of an event, a local work group event, include a mixture of these things, and probably all of them, but not dependent on just one. So don't just depend on an email blitz to certain individuals. You actually think through the personal contact, especially with those organizations and leaders in the organizations that have not yet been invited or have not been participating in local work group activities of late. You want to make sure that you make a personal contact and then follow it up with an email or letter or something of that nature. Creating the sense of purpose and value of that particular event is going to be the best event because we're going to be able to do this, that, and the other. Find the priorities, the conservation needs within our local area, make sure that those local needs are known by agencies and organizations throughout our area that are operating. Oftentimes, a local work group in their effective promotion and marketing will think of a theme and a title to go along with that particular event or activity. If it's a stakeholder event, come in and tell us what it is that's needed in our area for conservation, something like that. Themes, titles, that sort of thing are very effective. I'm going to encourage that good facilitation is also part of that planning an effective event and making sure that we do have the right individual that can help keep the meeting going. Sometimes that is the chair. Sometimes, we've got someone in mind that's a member, that's a good facilitator. These are all options, or a more professional facilitation, person. But let's make sure that it's a different person than a chair or the district conservationist if you can, because that allows the chair to assume their role, in chairing the meeting. Also, the district conservationist can assume their role as being a participant and a member within the local work group rather than having to worry about the facilitation activities. Experience is really important in selecting a facilitator. In fact, those facilitators that have done local work group meetings before are probably at a premier, time, because you would want them to at least know what a local work group is and how they operate and what your operating procedures are for your local work group. But most importantly, that they're getting that audience and audience participation, or the participation of the members of the local work group. Having a facilitator, again, allows the chair and the NRCS staff to really fulfill their role and participate on the local work group as members. I mentioned that. And then the facilitator you want to involve in your session designing, the logistics, the notes, and follow-up. Have a good facilitator. And as you consider that good facilitator, there's some facilitation roles that we would ask them to take on. One would be to provide helpful techniques along the way to make sure the local work group participation is happening like we want. Maybe the invitations, maybe the promotion. That would be a part of a facilitator's role. In meeting, whether it's virtual, in person, or a blend, to keep the group focused on the task and keep them moving forward and making sure that there are notes that are taken during the course of the event is very, very important. If the facilitator is uncomfortable doing facilitation and note-taking at the same time, make sure you do have someone from someone's staff being able to take some notes on the side of what the discussion had and what the priorities that came from that discussion are. The facilitator should periodically review the progress of the group, making sure that we are following at least closely the session design and making sure that we've got time for various exercises and presentations for the event. They're encouraging the participation of the entire group that's there gathered and making sure that quiet people are heard and loud people are more quiet. They're protecting the ideas of the group. It may not be that particular idea that one or more of the group thought was the most important, but certainly you're protecting the ideas and the concepts and the priorities of the group as they're going along. A facilitator will manage conflict if it occurs within the course of any one of our style of meetings. And they certainly will confront disruptive behavior and make sure that that's not a part of our local work group discussion to keep the local work group working effectively. Some of the logistics to consider as you're planning for your meaningful local work group event is to make sure that you've got an event checklist. We've got an example of that we can make available to you. Pick a great location for the event, appropriate for the size of group that you're planning on having. Make it a comfortable place where there's good heat and light and presentation opportunities, that sort of thing. Remember that the room setup and seating arrangements is particularly important. And what I mean by that is if in many cases, rather than having one agency bring a lot of people that sit at the table, you would perhaps consider having one of those people along with the other members of the local work group represented by one individual, and maybe a place where others could come and listen in to the debates and discussion, but it wouldn't overwhelm by just one agency or organization. You can do that with room setup and seating arrangements. It's important to have refreshments and or meals available if you're going to work over the lunchtime, if you're going to work over dinner time, a meal would be appropriate. Refreshments are always appropriate at the beginning, the coffee and the maybe donuts or something, the opportunity of people to just sit and enjoy each other's company for a little while before the meeting or during a break, and that sort of thing is important. It gets a little bit tricky because some organizations can provide refreshments for groups and meetings like this, and some cannot. And so you want to check with your local folks and make sure that you're following your government regulations regarding refreshments. NRCS is one that cannot normally provide refreshments and or meals for an event like that. Make sure that you've got the materials well in hand and you've got copies for all that you're planning on having at the local work group meeting. The maps, the data, the agenda, the materials, and worksheets are very important to have prepared in advance. And in organizing working committees, think through with the sponsors a bit about, should we have a working committee on this particular program or this project proposal or this activity? That could erupt from the discussion that occurs in the meeting or the event, or it could be talked about before and planned for before to make sure that we've got a working committee that would maybe not be the entire local work group, certainly, but a smaller group to work on things like ranking questions, for example, or a project proposal for RCPP or a project proposal for the State Water Quality Agency. And then also part of the logistics we've spoken about a bit would be your local work group operating policies that are available to everyone within the room. A good orientation is important too for new members so that they know what a local work group is, what their role is, and what our operating procedures are, and how they will gain from their participation. We've spoken about the planning of logistics for a local work group event. We've talked about the importance of facilitation and the importance of session designing and the importance of the logistics. Let's talk a little bit more about each of the styles of the events that you may have as a local work group and what would make your local work group meaningful. In an in-person event, you're really going to be looking, and this is a more traditional style of event that we've had for our local work groups, but that invitation and announcement, again, making sure that you reach out to those organizations and agencies you've not traditionally had working with you on your local work group and expand it much beyond just the NRCS programs discussions that you would have. The location is important for access to make sure that if it's a countywide activity, making sure that people can get there and have parking for their vehicles and that sort of thing, and ease of access if you've got folks that need more access needs than you might have considered before. Printed materials are very important for the in-person event. If you've got an in-person event, you want to make sure you've got copies enough for all the participants in your in-person event. Your audio-visual needs are very important. Have you got a big enough screen? Have you got the right projector? Have you got the right computer? And that sort of thing, making sure your audio-visual works, getting there early to set up the meeting room properly. I'd like to use in an in-person event, a U-shape or modified square representing each of the organizations that are part part of our local work group, at least with one seat at the table, that sort of thing. That's much preferred over classroom or that other types of activities. An alternative could be round tables and square tables for in-group exercises. Speaking of in-group exercises, you want to make sure that you use a simple format, which is that individuals at their place answer a question. What is the highest priority conservation issue, for example? And then talk about it a small group just right around their area, and then present those findings to the larger group and exercise. If you follow that basic format, individuals write things down first, go to a small group discussion, and have the larger group discussion, you'll find that'll work very well for you. The advantage for facilitation, in an in-person event is you can read the room. The facilitator can read the room. The chair can see what's going on. The primary staff people can read the room for needs. A need for a break, for example, after about 90 minutes, not much more than 2 hours. 2 hours is almost too much for, between breaks. And making mid-event corrections if needed. If there's a lot of discussion going on, maybe hold a break. The break is your friend. Take the opportunity to stop the meeting long enough to let people do what they need to do. Maybe take the break that they need in order to have a discussion, or take their physical and mental health and well-being into account. During the pandemic, we got used to doing virtual events, and there are certainly some benefits and drawbacks to a virtual event. Just to present a few, one of the ideas around a virtual event in preparing for just a virtual event alone would be the reliable network and the meeting software that you're going to use. Making sure that whatever it is that you select, whether it be this company or that company, that you're comfortable with it, you've worked with it before, and you feel like it can really be reliable and help you progress through a good event with your local work group. Invitations, announcements, and meeting links are very, very important, especially the meeting links and information about how to access a virtual event is particularly important, over the in-person, where we're trying to get people to a certain event center, to do work. We're trying to get people up on their computers with various levels of understanding about their computer networking capabilities and audio and that sort of thing. Make sure that you do have some sort of registration, attendee registration with whatever software you're using for your virtual event. And then do prepare your materials for participants, and you can send those in advance via the email with the link to the virtual event. So rather than making a lot of copies, you're only making the materials available electronically. Make sure that you've got good audiovisual needs, a strong signal, for the facilitator. This is where facilitation, I think, is very important. And for the facilitator and the sponsors and the presenters to have a practice in advance of the event itself. A couple days in advance, where you're changing up the audiovisual, the control of the audiovisual to a presenter, making sure that their machine and your machine are talking okay. It takes a very, very important part of what it is that we would want to do. The muting feature, the camera features, and the presentations are very important to plan for, but also important to practice. So the virtual exercises, this becomes a little bit more tough than being able to just have people write things down at their place in an in-person meeting. We're actually having now to use the chat or a question and answer system in this software. We can create breakout rooms in some of the software for small groups to have reports back, but you're looking for that virtual manner to get everybody involved, every participant involved in some fashion, whether it's through the chat or the questions and answer discussion or some other means that you may have available to you. It's hard for a facilitator to watch participants and watch the group dynamic, and for a chair and for the main staff people to be able to see their participants and when they might need a break and whatnot. So you have to be on your toes, and perhaps every 90 minutes putting a break together if the discussion is starting to wane or starting to, get a little bit controversial, then, bring about the opportunity for you to watch the participants as best you can and watch the meeting dynamic in a virtual event. People will find diversions. We found this with these new virtual events. They'll be looking at email, they'll be watching TV, they'll be doing, something else, other than the event itself. So for your facilitator, this is an important part of your work. For your host, a very important part of your work is finding exercises that keep them energized, in the moment, right, as best we can, and then working with you through that virtual event. As we come from the pandemic to a different part of our history, we're finding that people got comfortable with the virtual meetings and did not have to travel long distances to go to a meeting. So we're getting a lot more requests for in-person meetings by some people that have missed that and want to do that with a virtual participation component, that people that aren't quite comfortable yet or they didn't want to take the time to travel to a central event to participate in the meeting. They want to do that from their home base or their home computer or their business. Session planning is particularly even more important now for the blended in-person with a virtual participation at the same time. It gets really complicated to be able to think through the exercises, the activities, how you will process that material from both the virtual side and the in-person side, is a mold between these two, and it gets fairly complicated. The location is important for in-person access, as we mentioned before in the in-person meeting discussion. Materials now need to be printed for the in-person event and made electronic for the virtual folks that are with us during the course of a blended event. And your audio-visual needs really become more complicated because you want to have the in-person equipment, big screen, nice projector, good computer, strong microphone and speakers now become important in the meeting room so that the people that are participating virtually can actually hear that. And a strong speakers and a microphone to be able to identify and have speakers that are on the virtual network give presentation, and a participation system for the virtual part of it. They're using their chat, they're using this and that, and usually it's a good mix between a facilitator that's watching both, and sometimes you got somebody watching the virtual needs going on while the facilitator is watching the in-person activities. The chair's role is particularly important too, in making sure that everyone is heard, everyone's participating, and that we've got opportunity to reach concert decisions by the local work group. So this requires a combination of in-person and virtual exercises. So everybody at their table, everybody at their computer, jot down this, and then have a small group and large group discussion. Sometimes we do that small group and large group discussion in person fairly easily, but then small group breakouts and things, virtually become a little bit harder, but you can draw in their input and the questions and discussion for participants with both the in-person and the virtual sessions. More about these blended events, which, again, I can't emphasize enough the need for a great facilitator, one that knows the virtual side of things and the in-person side of things to get that kind of participation that you really want. So the in-person with the virtual participation, we're calling it the blended version. It's the hardest by far for facilitation. Being able to read the room for needs and making mid-event corrections. If you just got people in the room but you don't have the virtual side of it, becomes much easier than watching the virtual meeting needs and input from virtual participants at the same time. Again, you might split duties between the facilitator in the room and somebody that's watching what's going on the virtual side, and the Q&A on the virtual side and that sort of thing. Have another person beyond the facilitator then, is what I was just mentioning, to monitor that virtual participation needs. The practice session becomes even more important now because you're testing audiovisual tools, and if possible, you want to test those at the location. So sometimes you have to do the practice session just a few minutes before or an hour before the actual in-person session, so you can test that audiovisual tools, that microphone, that speaker system. Will people be able to pass a microphone around, in that in-person meeting so that people on the computers can actually hear what they're saying and talking about and whatnot, so you can start that dialogue going. There needs to be a central location for materials and presentations, and have a backup also. So your agendas, your session designs, your data sets, your maps, your things like that, your PowerPoint presentations and so forth need to have a central repository, you might say, for collection to make sure that we've got all of that in one spot so you can share it virtually or share it, make copies and do that in person. So again, the blended event, I believe, is probably going to be our future for effective local work groups, and those that are meaningful local work groups will be able to provide any one of these types of in-person, virtual, or a blended events for their local work group. We'll move now to our second topic that we want to cover during this presentation: who to involve and partners. Who to involve in your local work group activity, engaging our existing and our new partners and stakeholders, and the encouragement to move beyond just the folks that we've already worked with primarily in our local work groups and move to a more diverse group of folks that participate in our local work group events. Really great activity is a simple focus question that you can have individuals write their responses to, and then collect those responses and discuss them in terms of who we need to invite to our local work group. If we only had time, money, and energy to involve one additional organization or agency in our local work group, who would it be? And then have individuals write that down, and then have them write down a second additional organization or agency that we would invite beyond that first one. And then continue that activity, maybe do that 3 or 4 times, and then have a group activity where you share the number 1 that was on our list, the number 2s that were on our list, the number 3s that were on our list, until you develop that entire listing of potential local work group members to involve. Another activity in identifying partners and stakeholders would be to really examine that listing of partners that you've been working with to include any other stakeholders active in a natural resource conservation arena in your local area. And very important for us to complete a locally developed listing for the involvement that we want in our local work groups. This should be a locally generated, locally led kind of activity of who we want to involve in our local work group. And then, to complete that exercise, you would send invitations to organizations and agencies based on the benefits for their organization to participate in local work group events and activities. If you needed a jump start regarding some examples of partners and stakeholders that we've seen in local work groups across the nation, certainly we would start with the conservation district supervisors and their staff, and again, for all the reasons we mentioned before, to host and to chair local work group sessions. These are state natural resource agencies, and they're different from state to state for water and for soil, for conservation, for land use, but do an analysis of your state natural resource agencies and make sure that people are invited from those natural resource agencies to participate in the local work group. As we've talked about in the state, we also would do an analysis of the federal natural resource agencies and determine what federal agencies are operating in the conservation arena in our local area and invite them to our local work group. Then we would move to our agricultural organizations, usually specific to the local area. Is it wheat, potatoes, soybeans, corn, whatever it might be, livestock, and Farm Bureau and Grange, and some of those folks are good candidates for local work group representation. Move to the fish and wildlife organizations. Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Quail Forever, salmon. Oftentimes there are several different fish and wildlife organizations operating in your local area, and you want to invite them to your local work group meetings. Environmental organizations, Audubon, Nature Conservancy, and several other environmental organizations may be operating a chapter within your local work group area. Invite them to be a partner and a stakeholder in local work group sessions. Certainly our state and locally elected officials and or their staff would be important. So those that are in the House of Representatives, the Senate, members of Congress, staff people, look at the city and county elected officials too that you can also have participate in your local work group sessions. We've got examples where just having that elected official in that local work group session meant that we were able to receive some funding from state or federal sources we weren't able to receive from before. And then get specific to maybe other natural resource related organizations that you can think of that are operating within your boundaries. And don't make it a requirement that you have to agree with that organization on everything that they do, but make sure that they're invited to the local work group table. Well, certainly our NRCS designated conservationists for our local work group area will be there, and you want them to participate. And you want our Farm Service Agency County Executive Director and County Committee members to be invited to participate. On our list should be the Cooperative Extension agent from the particular area for the local work group. And then if you're lucky enough to have representatives of our American Indian governments, have them also invited to our local work group sessions. This, plus the list that you just came up with through that exercise I just gave you, should give you a good rounding of stakeholders and partners to ask to be local work group members. Let's move now to partnering for local work group activities. In partnering for local work group activities, there are three things that all the local work group members need to have. First is to know their role and the clarity of that role in working on the local work group. The second, in regards to that, is to have information so that they can fulfill that role. A third, and perhaps most important, is to have a meaningful contribution in the work of the local work group and its participants. So to be successful in local work group activities, we need to first recognize that the members are really attracted to projects and activities that result in something they see value in as individuals or to their organization, and hopefully both. And with that attraction and with that, you might say, motivation to participate in local work group activities, that you're producing projects, activities, practice, promotion, that sort of thing, sharing resources, they really see value in. And certainly that transcends to programs and projects based on that local work group event or activity where you've identified those programs, projects, and practices based on that local work group work, and you're actually seeing proposals and things develop from that capitalize on the shared resources, the time, the money, the people, the data, and other that you've been able to identify, because that is the leveraging or multiplying investment that partner organizations would get from the participation in a local work group event or activity. As part of partnering, it's logical to think that area proposals would be developed by the partners. A proposal that could address the highest priority natural resource issue or issues in a high priority area in our local work group, including what is that natural resource issue that we've identified. Where is the priority area where that's located, and that we would work upon that resource issue together. What practices would we promote to address that natural resource issue? What potential programs could we use to address that issue? What funding would be needed to run a particular program to get the practices on the ground with the landowners and land managers in that priority area around that natural issue in that local work group area? And then which partners should we be involving in this proposal and in this activity? This is very logical in the sequence of events that occurs for a well-placed, well-thought-out regional conservation partnership program application. Now then, with stakeholders invited, the membership representing a diverse set of organizations and agencies, and now the partnering that goes on and the development of proposals, there's usually the next steps that we need to talk about. And certainly the local work group then would identify what follow-up actions would be needed from a local work group event or a proposal or an activity. What are some target dates that we need to revolve around those actions for? And then who would be responsible for the follow-up activity around certain actions around those target dates? And never leave a meeting or event of the local work group without setting our next meeting date, the location, and time of that local work group event. Look for opportunities for local work group members and organizations to provide sponsorship of certain operating needs. One of them would be facilitation. The opportunity for an organization to either pay for or have a trained facilitator from their own organization supplied to the local work group for their activities. Certainly a meeting room could be something that would be sponsored by a local work group member, and especially those local work group members that aren't inhibited by certain government rules that can't rent a meeting room. So those organizations and agencies that would want to supply a meeting room for the local work group. We've spoken a bit about the refreshments and meals, and there is some of the organizations that cannot provide those things, and there's certainly organizations that can provide refreshments and meals for local work group events, and you're asking for their sponsorship of some of those activities. Materials, the copies and other things, and development of the data and the resource sets and whatnot can be something that can be sponsored by a local work group member or members. Data and maps to go along with the materials, very, very important. Wall size maps so that the group would have an easier time to look at some of those priority issues and priority areas in our local work group area. And certainly the net meeting sponsor, someone with the software that they've been using for net meetings, and a facilitator that's familiar with virtual meetings or blended meetings would be very much a sponsored activity of one of the local work group members. And audiovisual equipment can come from any one of our local work group members. Good, high-quality audiovisual equipment, and especially if you go to the blended system, the strong microphones and speakers in a room to be able to get that blended effect, of both listening to the in-person and then also being able to have that reverberated back to our folks that are on the virtual environment, and being able to have them hear and speak to each other, as if they were in the same room together. So this represents just a partial list of some of the sponsorship that can come from any one of the local work group members. And by all means, let's move beyond just NRCS or just the Conservation District providing this. This can be provided by any one of the local work group members. We'll now move to our third and final topic that we wanted to present in our Leading a Successful Local Work Group. Our first recommendation will be to expand the vision for the local work group in your area beyond EQIP, beyond any one USDA program, and expand that vision to work on several different programs, several different opportunities that exist in the local area. And that will help us with increasing the meaningful participation of the stakeholders and the local work group members toward those conservation issues that need to be addressed. Our third recommendation, or third tip, is to identify the priority natural resource needs and do that together. Identify what those needs are and prioritize those. This is the first priority, second priority, third priority we would work on together. And with that, the fourth tip deals with the geographic areas for those resource needs and concerns. Making sure that we talk about this area in this particular local work group area is most important for that natural resource need, and the ability to be able to focus our energy and effort on a geographic area for a priority natural resource need. So your listing should have the priority resource, natural resource need, but it also will have related to that is the geographic area where that need is. And with these top four tips, it's logical that our fifth tip would be to develop projects that are based on that meaningful participation, the increased vision, the identifying of priority resource needs for that local work group area, and the geographic areas where those resource needs exist. And that we would develop projects, proposals, program proposals, and practices that we want to promote within the body of those first four tips. Our sixth tip then is to identify the programs that would actually meet these conservation needs that we have in our local area. So if we've got a good handle on those priorities and geographic areas of concern, and we've started to develop project proposals, then certainly there are programs out there to meet those needs. The seventh tip is to share resources among the partner organizations in our local work group and make sure that the staffing is shared and the funding is shared, ideas are shared, time is shared, data is shared within the body of the local work group. An eighth tip would be to get a great facilitator. Have that facilitator available to you, and when the local work group need it, make sure that they're on tune, that they really don't have a bias towards one organization or one program, and can really keep a group going and participating and functioning well. Another tip is to utilize a local work group as the local gathering of organizations and agencies when it comes to natural resource work and natural resource priorities and programs and project proposals and that sort of thing. Again, if I promoted one concept here on the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, a USDA program, it would be this, that there would be a local gathering that would happen regularly, much more than just once a year, and much more than one program to address these resource needs and what we need to do about them. And then finally, the information and coordination. Partnerships move at the speed of trust. And so being able to inform each other about programs that are available, new status and staffing, funding, technical assistance, and that sort of thing, being able to talk about those things regularly at the local level where it really counts is what will make a great, successful local work group. And with that, what a pleasure it's been to be with you today and to share with you 3 topics around leading a successful local work group. And just for information's sake, placing my contact information on the screen for you so that you can email me or call me with a question around local work groups and making them successful. Thank you so much.